In 1972, a crack commando unit was sent to prison by a military court for a crime they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from a maximum security stockade to the Los Angeles underground. Today, still wanted by the government, they survive as soldiers of fortune. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team. When I was a kid, the A-Team, the Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider, the proper one with David Hasselhoff and the right voice for Kit, was staple early evening Saturday night television watching in our house. My dad would slump down in front of the television at lunchtime. He was a teacher, so he was always very tired by the time he got to the weekends. And he would watch Saint and Gruzy, followed by the whole of Grandstand and Final Score, and finally we would wrestle the remote off him, and we would watch B.A. Baracus convert the van into something, and the A-Team would rescue the underdog. Regular David and Goliath stuff. My brother can still recite the opening monologue to the A-Team. I checked last time he was up staying with us. I don't think it's a particularly useful skill. I'm sure he's not got it on his CV or anything. Me? Well, I can sing you the books of the Bible in order. Don't panic. I'm not going to inflict that on you. My friend David and I used to try to do it all in one breath, and he could do it and I couldn't, and that always used to really annoy me. What can you do? Can you still recite your multiplication tables? Do you know your favourite cricketer's batting average for the last 10 years? Perhaps you know every World Cup final score. My point? My brother and I were brainwashed by the practices of our childhood, and my mum is sitting right there, so I'm sorry, Mum, bear with me. My brother and I were brainwashed by the practices of our childhood, and here is a question for you. Which is more sinister, being able to recite reams of television dialogue, or being able to locate the minor prophets? In my lecture this afternoon, I'm going to argue that there is no such thing as a neutral classroom or value-free knowledge, and moreover that they wouldn't be desirable. Borrowing a theme from qualitative data analysis, my belief is that the danger lies in not in having assumptions, but in not making them explicit. So, my three headings are alien anthropologists. The educator has the duty of not being neutral, and that's a quotation from Paulo Freire. And what I need is a strong drink and a peer group, which is also a quotation, by the way, not a statement of fact, although that might be how we all feel by the end of the lecture. So first of all, alien anthropologists. Imagine, if you will, that a little band of alien anthropologists lands at the Trafford Centre, or Liverpool One. Now, I don't know what the collective term for anthropologists is, so we'll just have to stick with band for now. Anthropologists observe, they describe, and they reinterpret our social worlds and our cultural practices to try to understand and re-represent their meaning, what has value to us, and what are the stories that we tell back to ourselves about who we are in the world, and more importantly, why. In his sketch for a self-analysis, Bourdieu wrote that to understand is first to understand the field with which and against which one has been formed. Now, 30 million people visit the Trafford Centre every year, and it does feel like I sit behind most of them on my daily commute on the M60. 26 million visit Liverpool One. If our alien anthropologists engaged in a bit of non-participant observation at the shopping centre, what would they conclude about the stories that we tell ourselves, the practices that shape us, and the goals of our culture? And here I should say that I'm drawing heavily on the work of Professor Jamie Smith and his Cultural Liturgies project. And Professor Smith argues that the aliens might draw the following four conclusions. First of all, I'm broken, therefore I shop. All the images in the shopping centre are of happiness, fulfilment and pleasure. Billboard Mum has it all together. Her people carrier is sparkling clean, and it's not knee-deep in layers of crisp packets and uneaten snack packs of raisins. This isn't you, those advertisements tell us. There is a disconnect. It holds up an ideal of which we fall short. Number two, I shop with others. Going shopping is often a social phenomenon, but Smith argues that it fosters competition, not community. As you sit in Starbucks and people watch, how do you size them up? Last year's iPhone? Too fat for that top. Abercrombie and Fitch. The bustling shopping centre, Smith argues, is a cover for the construal of human intersubjectivity as fundamentally competitive and reductionist. Third, I shop, and in my case I shop and shop. Therefore I am. The practices of the market invite us to see consumerism as a way to solve a problem, except that when you get it home, you forgot that it needed batteries, or several months later, there is a new version that you don't have. So what the mole valorises as sacred today will be profaned as so last year, tomorrow. Fourthly and finally, the aliens might conclude, don't ask, don't tell. Nobody at the shopping centre wants us to ask where this stuff came from, who sewed the garment in a sweatshop, what will pass through our homes and be in landfill tomorrow. Don't ask, don't tell, just consume. What would happen if next we sent our alien anthropologists to the classroom? Now, I deliberately haven't worked through that example for you because I want you to go away thinking about it. Smith asked the critical question, which is to what extent these consumerist practices shape the way that we do education. A dominant model of education sees the human subject primarily as a thinking thing. Those of you who remember your Plato and Descartes will be aware that the elevation of reason and the assumption that thinking constitutes a neutral or objective process is one of the key products of Greek classical and Enlightenment thought. But I want to argue that before we are thinkers, we are believers, and Jamie Smith would say, before we're believers, even, we are lovers. And I agree with him that we need to recognise the degree to which thinking operates on the basis of faith. My second heading, the educator has the duty of not being neutral. So I've tried to suggest that neutrality is in fact a fallacy, that we all make sense of ourselves and our worlds through stories, and the stories that we're told form us. So my next step is to acknowledge that education will always be for something, whether we reflect on it or not, and that it's dangerous not to reflect on it. Yet I think we are stuck with a view of knowledge, a view of knowledge and of teaching and learning in our classrooms, which assumes that the goal of education is to transmit a set of disembodied facts and values that everybody shares to the next generation. Signe Sandsmark writes that when the basis for education in the common school is discussed, the focus is always on values, not on worldview. It seems more or less taken for granted that the common school in a pluralistic society must be secular. And there seems to be an underlying presumption that secular schools are more acceptable for believers of different religions than religious schools could be for various groups of secular people. Regardless of whether a school is a faith school or a common school, and I think that every school is really a faith school in some way, I'm asking this question. To what extent have they explicitly reflected on what education is for and the extent to which the practices of teaching and learning in that school affirm or undermine that vision? My doctoral research was an anthropological study of Emmanuel City Technology College in Gateshead. And in the early 2000s, that school hit the headlines for the alleged teaching of literal creationism in science and for being run by fundamentalist Christians accused of brainwashing the children who attended. And they were the target of relentless media campaigning and an orchestrated attack by those who opposed the academy policy and faith schools. Questions were raised in the House of Commons. I think it's worth stating publicly for the record that a review of the material used to teach science at Emmanuel by the then Chief Inspector at Ofsted, Mike Tomlinson, decided there was no basis on which to pursue the matter, and both the Guardian and the Tribune retracted their criticisms. Now, Emmanuel consistently has an A to C pass rate at GCSE, including Maths of English, of 97%. Because they're a city technology college rather than an academy, they don't control their own admissions. Those are administered externally by the National Foundation for Education Research, although there is always a question about who feels qualified to apply in the first place. So it's an outstanding school. in terms of performance. My research is critical, but possibly not on the basis that you would expect it to be. I wanted to know what the cultural experience of students was in a school that was that explicit about its Christian ethos, and which prioritised acts of collective worship in assembly, Bible teaching during tutor times, and confessional religious education, philosophy and ethics compulsory for all students in all years, right through to year 13. What I found was a set of pedagogic practices that conformed utterly to transmission modes of knowledge, and those practices also regulated theology and approaches to teaching and learning about and from the Bible. So that means that Christian belief was understood by the sponsors as an intellectual assent to a set of first principles. And I found little evidence that it impacted the students. To quote Terence McLaughlin, it did not fully penetrate their perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, and dispositions. Now, in respecting learning about religion, but assuming that it belonged in very specific structural spaces in the life of the institution, largely irrelevant to their own cultural practices, students were rehearsing a powerfully dominant assumption that education is a neutral space. Religion doesn't belong there. It's a space where I get the qualifications to get me a good job, and I don't really have to have meaningful conversation with people who are different from me, or engage with deeper questions about what knowledge is for or how I learn. And in my thesis, I argued that the structure of pedagogy at Emmanuel belongs to a modernist paradigm, which dangerously minimises the social context of learning and its embodied nature, elevating reason above all else. As an aside, but an important one, Susan Harding has argued that an unwillingness on the part of the research community to investigate religious fundamentalism, particularly as it manifests itself within the Christian faith, weakens our philosophical understanding of the liberal democratic state. Her thesis is that far from being a marginal force which kind of periodically thwarts liberal progressivism, religious fundamentalism should not be seen as other, but as a product of modernist discourse. I think her argument's important for two reasons. Firstly, because it asserts that the defence of autonomy leads liberal pluralism to define or perhaps even create fundamentalism. And secondly, because it implies two important questions: how the liberal democratic state decides which religion to tolerate, and whether it should even be making that decision. Unsurprisingly, I found that two separate communities had emerged in that school: those that identified with the Christian faith of the sponsors and those that didn't. And that created hierarchy and it created division. Because if you went to the Wright church and you could recite all the books of the Bible in the right order and in one breath, you had power in that structure. And throughout his work, Bourdieu consistently challenges the notion that the production of academic knowledge is a neutral activity. Bourdieu was born in 1930. He grew up in Berne, which is a rural village in southeastern France. And his grandfather had been a peasant sharecropper, but his mother came from a wealthier peasant family. And his father was a minor civil servant. And Bourdieu describes himself as separated from his classmates at primary school because of his father's white-collar education, and then separated from his peers at the boarding school because of his rural accent and provincial ways. And one of the things that characterises Bourdieu's early education is a feeling of not belonging and an awareness that his relationship with his peer group didn't match the lofty ideals proclaimed in the rhetoric of the classroom. And he describes this acute awareness of social difference as a terrible education in social realism. When Bourdieu died, 2002, he held the high honour of a chair at the Collège de France and was a famous public intellectual. I'm sure there's an element of mythologising in the story of kind of like peasant boy made good. But it illustrates how our attitudes and assumptions and dispositions are unconsciously formed and regulate practice in the social world. And interestingly, the solution that Bourdieu advocates is not the pursuit of education for its own sake. It's not even throwing people together and making them work together. It is conscious reflection upon reflection and the intentional structuring of a community of practice. Now, I'm aware that since I wrote my synopsis for this lecture, with really well-chosen words like public hysteria about fundamentalism. The issue of governance in Muslim schools in Birmingham, Bradford, and Manchester has arisen, and I am far less well equipped to comment on this than some of the other things in my lecture. But I do just want to offer a few observations before I move on to my final theme, which will briefly posit an alternative to the neutral classroom. Since I've argued that context is everything, you need to know some of mine. I am a foundation governor of a Church of England school, and in that setting, being explicit about the mission and the values of the school and setting a strategic vision for setting a strategic vision for how our community grows together and learns together in the sight of God is my responsibility. Now, I understand that as a follower of Jesus, if I were a governor in a community school, my strategic role would be both similar and different. I'd still be accountable strategically for the mission and values of the school, and I do believe that as a person of faith I can make a meaningful contribution to that conversation without having to suspend my religious faith and leave it outside the door. But I would consider it important that there had been genuine and explicit reflection on who the community of that school is and what's important to them. I would not, and I'm speaking entirely on a personal basis here, consider it inappropriate to enlist the pupils at that school in the Christian cultural practices that are a huge part of the rhythm of my life. But I recognise that I might need help from other people to point out what those practices are for me, because we need others to help us in the process of reflection. The goldfish doesn't see the water that it swims in. So what this does is lead me full circle to say that transmission modes of pedagogy, which perpetuate the fallacy that the classroom is a neutral place and that knowledge is just a body of facts to be mastered, are dangerous in both faith and community schools because they ignore the reality of power and the social construction of learning. My final heading, thanks to Douglas Adams, what I need is a strong drink and a peer group. US Airways Flight 1549 was a domestic route from New York City's LaGuardia to North Carolina. On January the 15th, 2009, they hit a flock of birds, which killed both engines. Captain Sullenberger landed the aircraft on the Hudson River, and everybody survived. How did Sullenberger do that? Did it require a miracle? Well, possibly, and I'm completely sure that God was present in it, but mostly it required Captain Sully to be faithful to the training and the preparation formed out of hours and hours of flight time. So it was a moment when the training of a lifetime enabled him to make split-second decisions, aided by a really steady nerve, to make a safe landing. And N.T. Wright compares this with the development of character or virtue, arguing that the Christian story is about the coming of God's kingdom, and the question for Christians is how do they live, what do they love, and what do they do in the light of that kingdom. So essentially what I want to do in this final section is introduce an alternative anthropology for teaching and learning being worked out in the context of Christian schools in the United Kingdom, the United States, and in Australia. And in its theoretical underpinning, it draws heavily on Bourdieu and his theory of social practice, and on Wenger and Larve and the creation of communities of practice. But theologically, it draws on Augustine and on N.T. Wright, who emphasised the primacy of love and of imagination in shaping our identity and governing our orientation to the world, essentially a virtue ethics approach. And what Professor Jamie Smith has done is brought these together, these social and theological lenses, in his Cultural Liturgies project, and argues that education is about the formation or the aiming of our love and desire, and that such formation happens through embodied communal or collaborative practices. So I'm quoting from Jamie Smith directly here. The argument is not that cognitive or worldview approaches and intellectual reflection are wrong, but only that on their own they're inadequate. And this inadequacy stems from the stunted anthropology that they assume. Such a picture of education is insufficiently radical because it doesn't get to the root of our identity. By fixating on the intellectual aspect, such a model of the person and its corresponding picture of education undervalues and underestimates the importance of the affective. By focusing on education as the dissemination of information, we've missed the ways in which education is really a project of formation. In other words, the heart of the argument is an anti-reductionism and the affirmation of a more holistic understanding of human persons. What if learning is a distinctively Christian approach to teaching and learning, which supports this question of pedagogical engagement with the question of what it means to be human across all curriculum subjects? And it uses 3 interrelated steps to promote a reframing of teaching and learning practices within a Christian worldview. And the steps can be summarised as seeing anew, choosing engagement, and reshaping practice. And the approach is premised on the idea that relatively small changes or shifts in practice can reframe the content of a lesson and the practices of the classroom. So seeing anew is a reference to what the teacher does in choosing a different perspective from which to teach the lesson. For example, in a PE or a physical education lesson, you might move from conceptualising sport as individual competition to building up one another corporately through coaching. The choosing engagement step helps teachers to think about choosing strategies that will explicitly engage students with the reframing during the lesson, such as pairing them up to coach and give feedback with an emphasis on looking for opportunities to offer praise. And reshaping practice focuses attention on the routines and the habits of the classroom, and those are the bits that often get ignored, and yet they repeatedly shape what teachers and students do. And what my research at Emmanuel showed was that when left unattended to, those practices can contradict the explicit ethos of the school, and they're actually the most powerful bit in shaping what it is that your students learn and know. So what if learning is rooted theoretically in Wenger's community of practice theory, which argues that learning always takes place within the context of a shared imagination or a telos, whether that's explicitly reflected on or not? And this sense of the bigger picture, the telos of the practice, that's what Wenger means when he talks about imagination. And his research into the shared learning practices of office workers demonstrated how hidden, unreflected upon bureaucratic structures and processes can shape people's understanding of what it is they're doing. Professor Smith's research into the pedagogy of language teaching found that those practices into which language learners were inducted, particularly but not exclusively in the UK, affirmed a shared imagination of tourism. Where is the station? Où est la gare? Smith argues that this stems from Western consumerist anthropology privileging individualism, and he suggests that it's problematic for a Christian school wishing to affirm a distinctive vision of what it means to be human, created in the image of God and committed to the good of the other. So in The Gift of the Stranger, Smith and Carville reframe language pedagogy in the light of some themes you find in the Bible relevant to the discipline, such as Imagio Deo, Babel, Pentecost, the stranger, and hospitality. And what If Learning has done is built on this work, extending it to teaching and learning practices across subject areas. In the Northwest, we have a What If Learning hub. And Church of England and some joint Church of England and Roman Catholic schools in the Diocese of Liverpool, Chester, Manchester and Blackburn are using the approach to reframe their teaching and learning. So we've got schools that are using it as a lens through which to plan the new primary curriculum, to reframe their early years provision, and to support other schools in their clusters who are coming out of special measures. And in September, we're going to be reporting on how a specific research project, which has been capturing how teachers use What If Learning, and how it's embedded and what shifts in practice it's promoted. And colleagues here, and Tony, you referred to this, will know that I'm sort of emerging blinking-eyed back out into the sun out of months being locked in my office doing the data analysis for this project. And to close, I'd like to share with you a profile of one of the teachers who worked with us on the research. And I've chosen a physics example because everyone's assumption is that you can't do this in maths and science. So Ryan came into teaching because he loved communicating his subject, which many of us as teachers will identify with. And this is how he describes physics. I guess physics fundamentally is, we want to understand the universe, we want to understand how it works, and the dream of physics, the dream of physics is to boil that down to the very, very simplest underpinning principles. He's a very person-orientated teacher, so he desires that his students think philosophically and morally about the human implications of physics, as well as understand the abstract principles. And alongside of this, Ryan does self-identify as a Christian, who desires that his science and his Christian theology resonate with each other. So he doesn't see the science and religion debate as primarily adversarial, although he's aware that many Christians do, and that the pupils are largely influenced by that perception that you can't be a Christian and a scientist. So in his log, Ryan records a brief conversation with one of his Year 9 students, which illustrates this. The student asked Ryan how I find science given my personal faith, which he's aware of due to involvement in the worship band. I responded that I love science and enjoy that it better enables me to understand creation. I also tried to emphasise that science is an empirical discipline, and it is their responsibility as budding scientists to examine the evidence available to them and draw their own conclusions. So throughout the project, Ryan articulates a desire that his students adopt a similar attitude to science, not in the sense of viewing it from a Christian perspective, but in the sense of not being unthinking in their acceptance of science as unquestioned. And in his log, Ryan identified 2 significant questions for him about the what-if learning approach. First of all, how do you make lessons kind of genuinely spiritual rather than just tokenistic? And second, how will atheist staff respond to this spiritualisation of science? And so those 2 questions were intertwined in his thinking about the research project, and creating ideas that colleagues would be able to use, whatever their own faith, became a key goal. However, in aspiring for this goal, Ryan was also concerned that the Christian ethos dimension should not be wishy-washy. He aspired to something that was genuinely spiritual and normalised talking about faith across the life of the school, recognising that staff and students were a very mixed group. Some Christians, other faiths, atheists, and probably many who couldn't care less or indifferent. Now, please do not misunderstand me, because in sketching out this alternate anthropology, I am not arguing that Christians are unique in their desire to see education facilitate human flourishing. I don't think distinctive is the same as unique. And a Christian telos or imagination will lead teachers like Ryan to affirm educational practices that are good and that are widely shared. And I hope also that it will free him to subvert those that are reductionist. Ryan needed other people to think about this with, by the way. He was part of a group of teachers from across disciplines with multiple worldviews and diverse cultural practices as he designed his lessons. That's part of the way that community of practice works in the design of the research. And many of the conversations did take place over curry and a beer, which might turn out to be one of the major research findings of what-if learning, that you can't do this without a beer and a peer group. It's one of the things that he's most positive about in his log, because functioning out of a disciplinary silo is still a very common feature of secondary school education. To summarise, I've argued that learning happens as we are formed in story and experience or practice, and that it matters, therefore, what the imagination of the story is, and that we are equipped to consider it and reflect on what makes us who we are. I've also argued that we need one another to do this. Now, my favourite literary hero of all time is Samwise Gamgee, and I'd love to be the kind of faithful friend and servant in the story that he is. I'm going to leave the last word to Sam. It is best to love first what you are fitted to love. I suppose you must start somewhere and have some roots, and the soil of the Shire is deep. Still, there are things deeper and higher, and not a gaffer could tend his garden in what he calls peace but for them, whether he knows about them or not. I am glad that I know about them a little. Thank you.